In mid-1943, test pilots at the Royal Air Force's Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford received a new American fighter for evaluation. Stepping onto the tarmac, they were simply baffled. Parked before them was a machine of staggering, almost absurd proportions. It weighed twice as much as their beloved Spitfires. With the wingspan of a small bomber and a massive, barrel-like fuselage, it quickly earned derisive comparisons to a 7-ton milk jug. By every established metric of the RAF's European Air Combat Doctrine, sending this heavy, lumbering mammoth into a dogfight didn't just look like a tactical error, it looked like a guaranteed death sentence. Yet, less than a year after those initial scathing assessments, this very same aircraft was annihilating the Luftwaffe over Europe and systematically shattering the German transportation network. How exactly did a fighter that mathematically failed its early British tactical evaluations become one of the most devastatingly effective combat machines of the Second World War? The answer lies buried within the original Royal Air Force combat trial reports and the operational archives of the United States Army Air Forces. When we pull apart the raw data from the Air Fighting Development Unit, a startling reality emerges. The British evaluators were not entirely wrong in their baseline math, but their standard testing protocols, honed during the desperate, twisting dogfights of the Battle of Britain, were fundamentally unsuited to measure the actual capabilities of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. They were evaluating a high-altitude, energy-fighting interceptor using the yardstick of a lightweight turn fighter. To understand this radical transformation, we must examine the precise moment when a handful of test pilots recognized what the engineers had actually built. By forcing a dramatic shift in air combat tactics to leverage the machine's massive Pratt Whitney engine, immense weight, and unique aerodynamic profile, they unlocked a potential that both Allied commanders and enemy pilots had completely missed. The P-47 would force a reluctant military establishment to abandon deeply ingrained aerial doctrines. It would terrify veteran Focke-Wulf pilots by doing the one thing they thought impossible in a steep dive, proving how a machine initially dismissed as a lumbering target ultimately dictated the terms of aerial warfare from the stratosphere down to the tree line. To understand the profound disconnect that occurred on the tarmac at Duxford, we have to look closely at the institutional memory of the Royal Air Force itself. By the time the first Republic P-47s arrived in Britain for evaluation, the RAF's fighter doctrine was already set in stone, forged in the intense, desperate crucible of the Battle of Britain. In the summer of 1940, survival for a British pilot meant one very specific thing: the ability to scramble rapidly from a grass strip, climb at a breakneck pace to intercept incoming bomber formations, and immediately engage in tight, swirling, horizontal dogfights over the English countryside. The machines that won that defensive campaign, the Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane, were lightweight, incredibly agile point defense interceptors. They were aerial fencers, nimble, responsive, and exceedingly dangerous in a turning fight at medium altitudes between 10,000 and 20,000 feet. Consequently, the Air Fighting Development Unit, the organization responsible for evaluating new Allied aircraft and formulating tactical guidelines, built their entire testing rubric around these specific, hard-won metrics. When an RAF test pilot strapped into a new fighter, he was looking for a tight turning radius, a blistering rate of climb, and immediate, snappy control harmony at low to medium altitudes. If an aircraft could not outturn or outclimb its adversary, British tactical doctrine dictated that it was fundamentally vulnerable in the combat zones of Western Europe. This was not a flawed philosophy. It was a highly logical, fiercely practical doctrine that had literally saved the nation from defeat. But it was a doctrine inherently localized to the defense of a small island and short-range sweeps over the English Channel. Across the Atlantic, the United States Army Air Forces were solving an entirely different strategic equation. American military planners were not looking to defend a localized, compact airspace. Their operational doctrine was being built around the unprecedented concept of daylight precision bombing, sending massive fleets of heavy, four-engine bombers deep into the industrial heartland of a hostile, heavily defended continent. To protect those bombers, they needed a fighter that could fly for hours, engage the enemy at the extreme freezing altitudes where the B-17s and B-24s operated, and survive heavy battle damage over enemy territory. They did not need a localized point defense interceptor. They needed a high-altitude, long-range escort. This fundamental difference in strategic vision was the genesis of the P-47 Thunderbolt, and it dictated every controversial curve of its enormous silhouette. The chief designer at Republic Aviation, Alexander Kartveli, understood that internal combustion engine performance drastically degraded in the thin air above 25,000 feet. To give his new fighter the power to dominate the stratosphere, Kartveli essentially designed the aircraft inside out, building it entirely around an immensely complex, highly efficient, forced induction system. This was not a simple mechanical addition bolted onto an existing frame. The exhaust-driven turbo-supercharger was a massive piece of machinery positioned far back in the rear fuselage. To connect it to the engine, heavily armored exhaust ducting had to run from the nose all the way under the pilot's cockpit to the tail, and then pipe the compressed, intercooled air all the way back to the forward intake. At the front of this vast internal plumbing system sat the heart of the beast, a 2,000-horsepower, 18-cylinder Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp radial engine. The sheer size of this power plant and the internal volume required by the supercharger ducting dictated a colossal airframe. To feed the thirsty radial engine, internal fuel capacity had to be massive. To utilize the unprecedented horsepower, a heavy, four-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller, over 12 feet in diameter, was required, which in turn demanded a tall, heavy landing gear to keep the blade tips from striking the tarmac. By the time Kartveli added heavy pilot armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a devastating battery of 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns housed inside the thick wings, the P-47 tipped the scales at roughly 14,000 pounds fully loaded. It was more than twice the weight of a standard Spitfire. It was, in fact, the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built at that time. When the British test pilots at Duxford initiated their standard evaluation protocols, they were unknowingly pitting their entrenched, agility-focused metrics against Kartveli's high-altitude behemoth. The results, printed clearly on paper performance charts, were predictably disastrous. In the testing zones where the RAF preferred to fight, the dense air at low and medium altitudes below 20,000 feet, the early Thunderbolt variants performed dismally. The official Air Fighting Development Unit reports were blunt and unforgiving. The test pilots recorded that the Thunderbolt's rate of climb was painfully sluggish compared to contemporary British and German fighters. If a Spitfire could rocket upward to intercept a sudden threat, the P-47 seemed to drag itself reluctantly into the sky. Furthermore, its acceleration in level flight at lower altitudes was measured and deemed totally inadequate for the sudden sprint of a dogfight. But the most damning metric, according to the strict RAF rulebook, was its turning circle. The immense inertia of the 7-ton machine meant that it bled kinetic energy rapidly in a sustained horizontal turn. If a British pilot attempted to fly the Thunderbolt like a Spitfire, pulling hard and continuously on the stick to outturn a simulated adversary, he quickly found himself skidding through the sky, rapidly losing airspeed, and presenting a massive, slow-moving target. The controls, heavily loaded by the sheer mass of the aircraft, felt exhausting and unforgiving in low-speed, tight maneuvering. The evaluators meticulously charted these performance metrics, drawing comparative lines against the Spitfire Mark IX and captured enemy fighters. The visual representation on those graphs was stark. At 15,000 feet, the Thunderbolt's climb line was a shallow, disappointing slope compared to the steep, aggressive vectors of the lighter interceptors. The test pilots, combat veterans who had survived the chaotic, twisting skies over Kent and Sussex by relying on split-second aerodynamic responsiveness, found the heavy American machine deeply disconcerting. The sheer physical effort required to haul the heavy control column around in a tight defensive engagement went against every survival instinct they had developed. They also noted the vast blind spot created by the enormous radial engine cowling, which severely restricted forward visibility during the climb. a critical liability when constantly scanning for enemy fighters waiting in the sun above. The disconnect was fundamentally rooted in a clash of engineering philosophies. The British were attempting to measure a heavyweight brawler using the delicate, precise rulebook of a lightweight fencer. They were demanding that a machine engineered specifically to operate efficiently in the freezing, thin atmosphere at 30,000 feet demonstrate its prowess in the denser air near the ground. It was an aerodynamic impossibility. The enormous internal turbo-supercharger, which added thousands of pounds of dead weight and complex internal drag at low altitudes, was effectively a dormant parasite when the aircraft was tested below 20,000 feet. Down low, the massive engine was suffocating in the thick air, unable to fully utilize the complex, forced induction system that defined its very existence and justified its massive weight. Therefore, the initial intelligence reports circulating through the Allied tactical commands painted a deeply pessimistic picture. A consensus was rapidly forming that the United States had produced an engineering marvel that was practically useless for the harsh realities of the air war over Northern Europe. The aircraft they mocked as the 7-ton milk bottle seemed destined to be relegated to secondary duties, deemed an outright failure in point defense combat against the seasoned veterans of the Luftwaffe. The official testing verdict was a near dismissal, resting heavily on the assumption that air combat would forever remain a localized, turning fight. The massive fighter appeared doomed to tactical irrelevance, effectively trapped by the rigid parameters of an evaluation doctrine it was never designed to satisfy. It would remain an expensive failure unless someone, somewhere, could figure out how to fight with an aircraft that supposedly couldn't fight. The rigid verdict against the Thunderbolt began to fracture only when the Air Fighting Development Unit finally pushed the aircraft into the one environment it was strictly engineered to dominate, the stratosphere. The turning point arrived during a highly documented series of mock combat trials, where the P-47 was pitted against the RAF's premier interceptor, the Supermarine Spitfire Mark IX. But this time, the engagement did not happen in the dense, forgiving air at 15,000 feet. The evaluators ordered both aircraft to climb past 20,000, then 25,000, finally leveling out above 30,000 feet, nearly 6 miles above the Cambridgeshire countryside. Up here, the fundamental physics of flight undergo a radical shift. The atmosphere is freezing, incredibly thin, and heavily starved of oxygen. For the Spitfire, flying at this extreme altitude was a delicate, straining balancing act. Its legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, though a masterpiece of aviation engineering, began to gasp for breath in the rarefied air, rapidly losing vital horsepower. Its aerodynamic control surfaces felt increasingly mushy, struggling to find any physical grip in the thin atmosphere. But for the Thunderbolt, crossing that 30,000-foot threshold was a sudden, violent awakening. The colossal exhaust-driven turbo-supercharger, the same complex, heavy plumbing system that acted as a dragging, deadweight parasite near the ground, was now operating exactly as Alexander Kartveli had envisioned. While the lighter British interceptor was slowly suffocating, the Thunderbolt's supercharger was aggressively ramming highly compressed, intercooled air directly into the 18 cylinders. At 30,000 feet, the Pratt Whitney power plant was essentially tricked into believing it was still operating at sea level, churning out its maximum, uninterrupted horsepower. When the mock dogfight commenced, the British observers on the ground expected the nimble Spitfire to easily outmaneuver the lumbering American machine, just as it had in the low-altitude tests. Instead, they witnessed a complete tactical inversion. The pilot at the controls of the Thunderbolt had no intention of entering a flat, horizontal turning circle. When the Spitfire moved to engage, the American fighter simply dropped its nose. In a fraction of a second, the aircraft's terrifying 14,000-pound weight ceased to be a crippling liability and transformed into its single greatest weapon. Gravity seized that immense mass, instantly converting potential energy into brutal, unstoppable kinetic momentum. The Thunderbolt accelerated downward at a rate that left the RAF evaluators stunned. The Spitfire immediately attempted to follow, pushing its nose over into a steep, aggressive dive. But basic physics dictated the outcome. The lighter British fighter simply lacked the sheer mass required to maintain that kind of terminal velocity. It fell hopelessly behind, the pilot watching the P-47 shrink to a distant speck against the earth below. Crucially, the Thunderbolt did not just run away. Hitting speeds well over 400 miles per hour in the plunge, the pilot hauled back on the control column, violently translating all of that gathered kinetic momentum into a towering vertical zoom climb. Borne upward by its massive weight and forced induction thrust, the heavy fighter rocketed right back into the stratosphere, effortlessly regaining the high ground. The clumsy 7-ton giant was now entirely dictating the terms of the engagement. By flatly refusing to turn, and instead operating purely on the vertical axis, diving, striking, and zooming away, the P-47 was completely untouchable. The official evaluation logs were rapidly rewritten. The staggering realization rippled through the test pilot community. The Thunderbolt was not a failed dogfighter. It was an uncompromising energy fighter. They had not been evaluating a bad aircraft. They had simply been flying it entirely wrong. Yet a profound, chilling uncertainty hung over these newly printed performance charts. Dominating a single Spitfire in a pristine, highly controlled test environment over England was one thing. But could this sanitized theoretical reliance on vertical energy fighting actually translate to the brutal, chaotic, and heavily defended skies over occupied Europe, where veteran Luftwaffe pilots were waiting? The burden of proving that theoretical physics could survive actual combat fell directly onto the shoulders of the United States Army Air Force's 8th Air Force. Specifically, the pioneering units like the 56th Fighter Group arriving in England in early 1943. When American commanders, including the fiercely pragmatic Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, reviewed the pessimistic British testing data, they did not dispute the mathematics. They simply recognized that they could not afford to fight a British war. Their mandate was to escort heavy bomber formations deep into Germany, operating at the extreme altitudes where the B-17 flying fortresses lived. To survive, Zemke and his peers had to ruthlessly reprogram their pilots, stripping away every instinct a young aviator possessed. The natural urge of a fighter pilot in combat is to track the target, to haul back on the control column, and to chase the enemy through a series of twisting, horizontal turns until the gun sight aligns. Zemke instituted a draconian tactical doctrine that strictly forbade this behavior. The new rule was absolute. You do not, under any circumstances, turn with a Focke-Wulf or a Messerschmitt. Instead, the Americans developed and enforced a doctrine known as boom and zoom. They were taught to treat altitude as a massive, constantly charging battery. Utilizing the enormous turbo-supercharger housed in the belly of the aircraft, the Thunderbolts would climb to 28 or 30,000 feet, positioning themselves miles above the incoming bomber streams. Up there, in the freezing, thin atmosphere, they waited. When the German interceptors rose to attack the bombers, the American pilots would roll their massive aircraft inverted and let gravity take hold of 14,000 pounds of metal. They would slash down through the Luftwaffe formations at terrifying speeds, often exceeding 450 miles per hour. The pilots were granted a split-second window, perhaps 2 or 3 seconds, to unleash a devastating wall of lead from their 850 caliber machine guns. And then came the hardest part of the discipline. No matter the result, even if the German fighter was smoking and simply required one more tight turn to finish off, the American pilot was ordered to pull back on the stick and use his massive kinetic momentum to rocket right back up to the stratosphere. They were to act as untouchable airborne snipers, striking from the vertical and vanishing before the enemy could bring their weapons to bear. It required immense psychological discipline to break off an attack, but it was the only way to keep the heavy fighter alive. Across the English Channel, the veteran pilots of the Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader II and Jagdgeschwader 26, the elite fighter wings defending occupied France and the Low Countries, initially viewed this bizarre new American machine with a mixture of confusion and contempt. When the first P-47 sweeps crossed the European coast in the spring of 1943, the visual misidentification by German intelligence was striking. The aircraft was so disproportionately large that early Luftwaffe airborne reports sometimes mistakenly identified the single-seat fighter as a new type of twin-engine bomber. When they realized they were facing a fighter, the German assessment was highly dismissive. The Luftwaffe pilots were flying the Focke-Wulf FW-190, a compact, heavily armed interceptor known as the Butcher Bird, renowned for its instantaneous roll rate and vicious agility. Compared to the sleek Focke-Wulf and the proven Messerschmitt Bf-109, the bulky Thunderbolt looked like a clumsy, lumbering target. In those early weeks, the Luftwaffe's overconfidence seemed completely justified. The rigid discipline of boom and zoom was not easily mastered, and inexperienced American rookies frequently succumbed to the adrenaline of combat, breaking Zemke's golden rule. Drawn into the chaotic, swirling dogfights at lower altitudes, American pilots attempted to pull their heavy machines into tight, horizontal turns against the veteran Germans. The results were immediate and fatal. Just as the British evaluators had warned, the massive Thunderbolt bled kinetic energy rapidly in a sustained turn, quickly decelerating into a massive, slow-moving target. German pilots gleefully exploited the Thunderbolt's horrific low-speed turning circle, effortlessly slipping inside the Americans' turn radius and shredding the large airframes with high-explosive 20mm cannon fire. For a brief deceptive window in the early summer of 1943, Luftwaffe intelligence summaries reflected a dangerous complacency, labeling the American P-47 as a tactical failure, a heavy, unmaneuverable paper tiger that posed little threat to the masters of European airspace. But as the summer wore on, the tactical inversion began to take hold. The 8th Air Force stopped trying to fight the Luftwaffe's war and ruthlessly forced the Germans to fight the Thunderbolt's war. The critical, horrifying realization for the Luftwaffe did not happen in a turning fight. It happened in a dive. For years, the German fighter pilot's ultimate survival mechanism, their guaranteed get-out-of-jail-free card when cornered by a British Spitfire, was a maneuver called the Split S. If a Focke-Wulf pilot found a Spitfire on his tail, he simply rolled his aircraft upside down and pulled hard into a sheer vertical dive toward the earth. The British Spitfires could not follow for two reasons. First, early Spitfires used the float-type carburetor. Pushing the nose down violently caused negative G-forces that flooded the engine, making it temporarily cut out and cough black smoke. Second, the Spitfire was simply too light. It lacked the sheer mass to match the terminal velocity of the heavier Focke-Wulf in a sustained plunge. The German pilots had relied on this aerodynamic escape hatch for years, trusting it with their lives. When the Thunderbolt formations began dropping from the stratosphere to protect the B-17s, German pilots instinctively reacted to being bounced by deploying their standard survival tactic. An experienced Focke-Wulf pilot, spotting the American fighter closing in, would violently roll his aircraft over, point his nose at the French countryside, and push the throttle to the firewall, expecting the heavy, clumsy-looking machine to vanish in his rearview mirror. Instead, the German pilot found himself caught in a terrifying physics trap. The Thunderbolt utilized a complex, fuel-injected pressure carburetor that did not stall under negative G-forces, allowing the American pilot to immediately push the nose over and follow. And in a steep dive, the terrifying 14,000-pound mass of the Thunderbolt became an unstoppable weapon. The heavy American fighter did not just follow the Focke-Wulf, it effortlessly accelerated past the German aircraft's maximum dive speed. The Luftwaffe pilots watched in absolute horror as the massive, barrel-shaped cowling of the Pratt Whitney engine rapidly expanded in their rearview mirrors, closing the distance with the unstoppable momentum of a falling anvil. The aerodynamic reality of a 500-mile-per-hour dive quickly turned the German escape route into a death trap. As the Focke-Wulf reached its critical Mach limit in the plunge, airflow over its wings would become disturbed, causing the controls to stiffen dramatically due to compressibility. The German pilot would find his stick locked solid, unable to maneuver, while the Thunderbolt, heavily engineered to remain stable at extreme velocities, bore down on him, unleashing a torrent of 50-caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The psychological shock rippling through the Luftwaffe was profound. The fundamental rules of survival had been rewritten overnight. The heavy machine they had mocked as a sluggish target was running them down in their own sanctuary. They could not outclimb it at high altitude, and they realized with mounting dread that they could no longer outdive it. Even more demoralizing for the Luftwaffe was the discovery that even when they managed to trap a Thunderbolt and pull the trigger, bringing the massive machine out of the sky was an entirely different, incredibly frustrating problem. This stark reality exposed the fundamental vulnerability of European fighter design. Both the German Messerschmitts and the British Spitfires relied on liquid-cooled, inline engines, specifically the Daimler-Benz and the Rolls-Royce Merlin. These engines were sleek, highly aerodynamic, and incredibly powerful, but they were also desperately fragile. A liquid-cooled engine relies on a complex network of internal plumbing, radiators, and a glycol-based coolant mixture to prevent it from melting itself into slag. In the chaos of aerial combat, a single stray 30-caliber machine gun bullet striking a coolant line or puncturing a radiator would cause the pressurized glycol to spray out into the slipstream as a white trail of vapor. Once the coolant was gone, the pilot had mere minutes before the engine block catastrophically overheated. The pistons seized, and the aircraft became a dead weight, forcing the pilot to bail out over hostile territory. The Thunderbolt possessed no such Achilles heel. Alexander Kartveli had built his fighter around the Pratt Whitney R-2800 double Wasp, a massive, air-cooled radial engine. There was no radiator. There was no glycol coolant. The engine consisted of 18 massive forged steel cylinders arranged in a double row, exposed directly to the freezing slipstream to radiate heat away from the block. It was a brutal, mechanically complex piece of industrial machinery, and it possessed a level of structural ruggedness that bordered on the absurd. Archival damage reports from 8th Air Force ground crews stationed at bases like Halesworth and Boxstead document a level of survivability that defied aviation logic. Thunderbolts routinely returned from deep penetration missions across Germany, with jagged holes the size of a man's head blown through the wings by flak. Mechanics photographed aircraft that had successfully crossed the English Channel and landed safely despite having 3 entire cylinders violently blown off the engine block by high-explosive cannon shells. The massive radial engine would shake violently, trailing dark smoke and spraying oil across the windshield, but it would simply refuse to seize, continuing to turn the heavy Hamilton Standard propeller just enough to get the pilot home. The sheer resilience of the machine was permanently burned into Luftwaffe psychology on June 26, 1943, during an encounter that remains one of the most thoroughly documented displays of the Thunderbolt's structural integrity. During a bomber escort mission, a P-47, piloted by Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, was ambushed and heavily damaged before he could react. His aircraft was crippled. The hydraulic system was shattered, spraying blinding, highly flammable fluid into the cockpit. The oxygen system was severed, and the aircraft was riddled with holes. Struggling to maintain control, Johnson found himself isolated and limping toward the English Channel. He was then intercepted by a Focke-Wulf 190, piloted by Egon Meyer, a highly decorated Luftwaffe ace with dozens of Allied kills to his name. Meyer pulled his Focke-Wulf up alongside the crippled American fighter. Johnson's canopy was jammed shut by twisted metal. He could not bail out, and his aircraft was too damaged to turn and fight. He was completely at the mercy of the German ace. Meyer confidently dropped his fighter back, slid directly onto the Thunderbolt's tail, lined up his glowing Revi gun sight, and emptied his machine guns into the American aircraft. Inside the cockpit, Johnson was violently thrown against his harness as hundreds of rounds impacted the fuselage. But the bullets simply sparked and bounced off the massive slab of armor plate positioned directly behind the pilot's seat. Realizing the machine guns were ineffective against the heavy armor, Meyer pulled alongside the Thunderbolt again, examining the smoking, shredded wreckage, likely baffled that it was still airborne. Dropping back a second time, the German ace engaged his heavy 20mm cannons. firing high-explosive shells directly into the Thunderbolt's wings and fuselage. The impacts blew massive holes in the aircraft's skin, snapping internal control cables and tearing away structural ribs. Yet, the air-cooled Pratt Whitney engine simply absorbed the shock and kept firing. Out of ammunition and staring at an aerodynamic impossibility, Egon Mayer pulled his FW-190 alongside the ruined American fighter for a third time. The veteran ace locked eyes with Johnson, shook his head in sheer disbelief, offered a crisp military salute to a man he believed was flying a ghost ship, and peeled away to return to his base in France. Johnson fought the agonizingly heavy controls all the way across the channel, somehow managing to land the shattered machine at a British airfield. When the astonished ground crews rushed to the aircraft and eventually pried the jammed canopy open to pull Johnson from the cockpit, they attempted to count the damage. They tallied over 200 individual bullet holes and 21 massive 20mm cannon impacts before they simply lost count. The entire airframe was twisted. The internal mechanics were reduced to scrap, yet the aircraft had brought its pilot home. As stories like this filtered through Allied intelligence and German debriefing rooms, the psychological calculus of the air war fundamentally shifted. Luftwaffe pilots realized that engaging a Thunderbolt required an exorbitant expenditure of ammunition to guarantee a kill. Ammunition they desperately needed to bring down the four-engine heavy bombers. The American fighter was no longer just an escort. It was an impenetrable flying tank that was physically grinding down the German fighter arm through sheer endurance and unbreakable metal. By the spring of 1944, the aircraft, derisively labeled the 7-ton milk bottle, had ruthlessly validated Kartvel's design, breaking the back of the Luftwaffe over northern Europe and establishing a doctrine of energy superiority that would shape air combat for decades. The British Air Fighting Development Unit's initial evaluations had been mathematically precise, yet tactically obsolete. But the ultimate irony of the Royal Air Force's initial dismissal was still waiting over the horizon. The heavy fighter, engineered exclusively for the freezing, thin atmosphere of the stratosphere, was about to be deployed by the British themselves into a theater completely antithetical to high-altitude combat, an environment that would demand yet another radical reinvention of a machine that simply refused to fail. Despite the scathing initial evaluations at Duxford, the British Air Ministry quietly proceeded to procure 830 Thunderbolts. Yet they made a highly unorthodox strategic decision. They did not assign these massive interceptors to the high-altitude fighter sweeps over occupied Europe, where the aircraft was theoretically meant to fight. Instead, the Royal Air Force shipped the heavy American machines halfway across the globe to the most logistically starved, physically agonizing theater of the British war effort, the jungles of Burma. The Burma campaign was an entirely different type of war. There were no massive bomber streams to escort, no pristine concrete runways, and no high-altitude duels in the freezing stratosphere. The conflict was defined by oppressive heat, torrential monsoon rains, and brutal, close-quarters combat against deeply entrenched Japanese positions hidden beneath a dense jungle canopy. It was an operational environment that exclusively demanded low-level ground attack and close air support, the exact opposite of what Alexander Kartveli had engineered his high-altitude Leviathan to do. Operating at treetop height meant the complex turbo-supercharger was completely redundant dead weight. It forced the aircraft permanently into the thick, dense air where British test pilots had mathematically proven it to be a sluggish, unresponsive failure. But combat operations under the Southeast Asia Command revealed a startling tactical paradox. The precise structural traits that penalized the Thunderbolt on a rigid point defense scorecard transformed it into an apex predator in a grinding, mud-moving ground war. Its enormous internal volume, dictated by the supercharger plumbing, provided staggering fuel capacity. This allowed British pilots to navigate massive stretches of hostile jungle, fly deep behind Japanese lines, and loiter over active battlefields for hours, waiting for infantry to call in strikes. The heavy reinforced wings, built to sustain extreme dive velocities, could effortlessly carry external payloads of 500 or 1,000-pound bombs, effectively turning the interceptor into a precision dive bomber. Crucially, fighting at low altitude meant flying directly into a storm of concentrated small arms and anti-aircraft fire from Japanese infantry. Here, the Thunderbolt's lack of a delicate liquid cooling system was a strict matter of survival. A single rifle bullet from the jungle floor could sever a Spitfire's coolant line, dooming its pilot to a slow engine death and a forced landing in hostile territory. The Thunderbolt's massive, air-cooled radial engine simply swallowed the ground fire and kept turning. By late '44, RAF squadrons had entirely abandoned their initial prejudices, wielding the heavy fighter as devastating airborne artillery. The Thunderbolt had evolved far beyond its original design specifications and Duxford's restrictive test metrics. But to truly understand why this mattered, we need to look at a moment when all these theoretical attributes, mass, speed, and armor, were tested to absolute destruction. In early 1945, during the brutal Allied push toward Rangoon, a flight of Royal Air Force Thunderbolts from No. 258 Squadron was tasked with a close air support mission that perfectly encapsulated this terrifying reality. The target was a heavily camouflaged Japanese supply depot and artillery position, deeply embedded in a narrow jungle ravine. To hit the objective, the pilots could not rely on the luxury of altitude. They had to thread a needle, diving at over 400 miles per hour into a claustrophobic corridor of ancient teak trees, releasing their 500-pound bombs at the last possible microsecond, and pulling out before slamming into the rising terrain. It was an operational environment that stripped away every aerodynamic advantage of a fighter, leaving only raw physics. As the lead Thunderbolt committed to the dive, the jungle canopy erupted. Japanese anti-aircraft crews had pre-sighted the narrow approach, creating a dense, overlapping wall of 20mm and 37mm explosive shells. At 400 feet above the deck, dodging was mathematically impossible. A lightweight, agile interceptor caught in this crossfire would have been vaporized, its thin wing spars shattered by the concussive blasts before the pilot even registered the threat. The British pilot at the controls of the P-47 did not try to turn. He couldn't. There was no airspace to maneuver. Instead, he shoved the throttle completely forward to the firewall, converting the enormous, plunging weight of his machine into maximum kinetic momentum. The Thunderbolt absorbed a brutal pounding. Heavy explosive shells detonated directly against the fuselage, tearing jagged strips of aluminum from the airframe and severing hydraulic lines. But the massive internal architecture, the heavy, multi-layered wing spars, originally designed to withstand the crushing gravitational forces of stratospheric dives, held firm. Forced dangerously low by the concussive barrage and the sheer, unyielding inertia of his pullout, the pilot slammed directly into the upper canopy of the jungle. This was the exact scenario where the Thunderbolt's staggering density defied all conventional aviation logic. At over 300 miles per hour, the fighter became a 7-ton flying axehead. The leading edges of its wings, packed with the dead weight of 8 heavy machine guns and layered with thick steel armor, violently sheared through solid tree branches 3 inches thick. The massive, unshielded Pratt Whitney radial engine acted as a brutal battering ram, swallowing leaves, heavy timber, and debris. Any liquid-cooled engine would have instantly ruptured its radiator, spraying its vital coolant and seizing within seconds. The Thunderbolt simply chewed through the canopy, violently shaking as the heavy wooden shrapnel battered the airframe. But the 18 steel cylinders continued to fire. The aircraft broke clear of the ravine, trailing thick smoke and actively shedding debris, but it was still flying. When it finally lumbered onto the pierced steel planking of its forward operating base, the ground crews were silenced by the wreckage. The leading edge of the right wing was smashed completely flat. A solid teak branch was physically wedged between the engine cylinders, actively burning against the hot steel, and the fuselage looked like it had been run through an industrial shredder. Yet, the pilot stepped out unharmed. In the unforgiving crucible of low-level combat, aerodynamic finesse meant absolutely nothing. Survival was strictly a matter of forward momentum and unbreakable metal. The aircraft that was too heavy to fight had become too tough to kill. When we look back at the shattered, oil-stained Thunderbolt sitting on the pierced steel planking in Burma, or the flak-shredded airframes returning to English bases from deep over Germany, the original Air Fighting Development Unit reports from Duxford take on a completely different meaning. It is tempting, with the luxury of historical hindsight, to dismiss those early British test pilots as foolish or stubbornly blinded by their romance with the nimble Spitfire. But reading through those meticulously typed 1943 evaluations reveals something far more profound than simple error. The Royal Air Force evaluators were entirely correct in their mathematics. They had accurately recorded the numbers. They were simply measuring the future of aerial warfare using the yardstick of the past. The initial rejection of the 7-ton milk bottle stands as a masterclass in the dangers of institutional inertia and military technology assessment. The British doctrine of lightweight, horizontal turning combat was not a theoretical philosophy. It was the exact, blood-soaked formula that had physically saved their nation in 1940. But when survival depends on a specific set of rules, those rules rapidly harden into absolute dogma. The testing protocols at Duxford were optimized to find the best possible version of an aircraft that already existed. They were fundamentally incapable of evaluating a machine that rendered their baseline parameters obsolete. Alexander Kartvel's high-altitude Leviathan was severely penalized because it failed to do things it was never meant to do. In a low-altitude arena, it was never meant to occupy. The military establishment expected the Thunderbolt to quietly conform to the established mechanics of the dogfight. Instead, the American engineers delivered a machine of such uncompromising mass and specialized power that it dragged the combatants into an entirely new dimension of warfare. The P-47 did not adapt to the traditional rules. It weaponized its own perceived flaws, its staggering 14,000-pound weight, its terrifying inertia, its blunt, unrefined radial engine, and used them to physically shatter the existing doctrine. It proved that agility was no longer the ultimate currency of the sky. Vertical energy, terminal velocity, and sheer unbreakable structural resilience had permanently usurped the tight turning circle. The British evaluators on that Duxford tarmac were absolutely right about what a fighter airplane used to be. They just couldn't comprehend what the Thunderbolt was forcing it to become. The fighter that the strict, dogfight-obsessed metrics deemed too heavy to fly effectively turned out to be the exact machine required to survive the brutal reality of a global war. In the end, the 7-ton milk bottle didn't just break the rules, it redefined the very physics of victory.